Welcome. Thanks everybody for braving the cold weather and coming out this evening. I'm Eric Ham, and I'm actually class of 2004. Yes, I'm old, but I'm not that old. And I certainly want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to this really exciting event that we have tonight, looking at the midterms and their impact on the 2018 elections. This has been an election that many of us, myself particularly, work in the media, we've been looking at and counting down the days until this election since President Trump actually won back in 2016. And so we have been waiting eagerly and anticipating what the impact will be of this midterm election and how it would play out. And so we've got a really phenomenal panel that we've assembled tonight to really look at the numbers and look at what really took place and not only what took place, but actually what's continuing to take place, because we know that as we speak, votes are still being counted. So we still don't know where things stand. But we have a really great group assembled who's actually going to tell us and hopefully project what we can expect. But before we get to that, what I want to do is, being an alumni of the Harris School, this is one of the first times that I've been back since I graduated 14 years ago. And when I was here, when I started at the Harris School back in 2002, one of the central things that was addressed and discussed when I was at the Harris School was how the Harris School was in its infancy, and how it had gone from being a committee to becoming an actual school. And so now, being back to the Harris School 14 years later, it's so amazing just to see how this infant, this baby, has grown by leaps and bounds. In fact, when I got there today, I told someone the only thing about the Harris School that I recognized was the lobby. Everything else looked different. And it's so much growth, and there were so many things that I learned about today, and everyone kept saying, well, you know about this, and I said, no, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. What is that? What is that? Tell me more. Tell me more. Kind of like the movie Grease. Tell me more. Tell me more. And I was just learning so much, and what became so clear to me was just the explosion that we see taking place, not just in terms of the enormous amount of students and energy that's taking place at the Harris School, but also this exciting and brand new state-of-the-art facility that's actually coming online in just another month. And of course, the policy labs that are also there that are giving students a hands-on experience about the role that policy will play, not only in their lives, but the lives of people seen and unseen. And so we are right now, I think, on the cusp of just a major sea change, politically, demographically, culturally, and the Harris School is working feverishly to make sure that we're ground zero for making sure that young people like yourselves are ready to take on these challenges. And so the Harris School is getting itself together, it's growing by leaps and bounds, and I'm so excited to be a part of this school, this once infant that's now growing and tackling the world. So I'm really excited about that. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have this conversation about some of these policy changes that we see that are taking place. And so what I want to do is I want to start with having a conversation with Jennifer Benz. And Jennifer Benz is the director of another new exciting project at the Harris School. It's this collaboration, this partnership with the Associated Press and NORC, working on looking at some of these changes that we see taking place and that we saw took place particularly in these midterm elections. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Jennifer Benz out, and she and I are going to kick off this conversation and talk about some of this amazing, groundbreaking work that they're doing, looking at some of the polling data that we saw come out of the midterm elections. You ready? Yes. Let's do it. Jennifer, join me here on stage. Oh, and for everyone who does not know, we know that it's like really cold and it's snowing outside. And I just want you to know that Jennifer came in from Hawaii. So we really want to thank her for braving the cold and leaving the beach to be with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So Jennifer, you all are doing some amazing cutting edge work. You all have looked at the numbers, looking at the numbers that we're still seeing coming out of the midterm elections. Tell us what some of the key findings that you all are looking at right now.
Yeah, so just to let everybody know some background, the AP and Fox News both left the traditional exit poll pool after the 2016 election. And we've been working with them ever since on a bunch of experiments and then finally launching a new product this year to basically replace the exit poll for them. And so we conducted a survey in 50 states, basically in the week leading up to the election, all the way through poll close on election day, and spoke to over about 120,000 voters and registered voters who sat out the election, and talked to them about, obviously who they were going to vote for, but also collected a lot of attitudinal and demographic information. And as a result of that, we have almost 30,000 young people in this data set from across the country. So in the days since the election, we've started to really dig into those data and try and get a sense of what young people were feeling and what was different about this midterm election compared to those in the past. And we also have been working with MTV over the past year, since March, to do a whole series of polls with people who are 15 to 34, so those folks who will be old enough to vote in 2020.
Let's step back for a minute, if we can, and look and talk a little bit about this new partnership, this new relationship between the Associated Press and NORC, kind of how it came together and what the objective of this project is.
Yeah, so the AP and NORC at the University of Chicago have very similar missions. Both organizations are interested in conducting nonpartisan research and getting that information out to the public. And so AP had been, running its own polling operation inside of AP, and for a long time, newspapers across the country were some of the leaders in social science research. But as those budgets started to constrict, it became more and more important to find opportunities to partner with researchers outside. And so our organizations came together in 2011. We conducted the first study. And we work sometimes with internal funding from AP, but also with grants from organizations. And what we try and really focus on is studying some of the pressing issues of the day, and making sure to, that we're doing sound science and that people's voices and attitudes and opinions become part of the national dialogue, especially for groups that might not otherwise get heard as often as they should.
Now, back in 2016, no one saw President Trump actually winning the White House, and organizations like yours really got creamed. They really just, people really came down hard on them. And people, I think, for the most part, really don't understand how you all really compile the data and how you all actually determine what will actually happen. Tell us where we are right now in terms of what took place in 2016 and what some of the numbers you all were looking at in 2018, and did you get it right? Were you off a little bit? Were you way off? Well, where are we right now?
Yeah, so in 2016, pollsters have come fond of saying that we generally got the national numbers correct. Most of the polling had Clinton up by a couple of points over Trump at a popular vote level. But where things really fell apart was at state polling and our ability to find out what was going to happen with the Electoral College. And so this AP VoteCast is what we call this new polling solution that basically replaces the traditional exit poll. And we combine high quality, probability-based sampling with the sort of quantity of interviews that you can get from non-probability, unscientific sampling or surveying, and put those samples together at a state level so that we can really get a high volume of interviews grounded in this high quality probability-based sample. And so that really let us dig into all of these different states. So we were able to make projections by 5 o'clock on election night, which is when AP and reporters start to need to use this information to make race calls and to try and understand what's happening at the ballot box. And looking at the Senate, we were able to project within the margin of error just about all of the races. That we had one miss. And that's in comparison to 2016, where the traditional exit poll the misses were more significant, and to the point where AP was no longer able to really use the data from it. This methodology is promising and is really giving us a lot of insights into what happened in 2018.
So let's go inside the numbers. Let's look at what actually took place a week ago, and particularly among young people.
Yeah.
And what were some of the numbers, or what were some of the things that jumped out at you?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting in the data so far is that, there were a lot of predictions going into this that it was going to be a huge, huge turnout among young people. And 2014 was a historically low turnout overall, and especially among young people. So 2018 looks great by comparison in terms of
So when you say
midterm
2014
turnout.
was bad, it wasn't just bad among millennials or young people, it was bad just across the board.
It was bad across the board. It was especially bad among young people.
Okay, you all were just the worst. Okay, I get it. Okay, got it.
And so 2018, it looks good by comparison, but I don't think the turnout numbers among young people alone weren't as overwhelming, I think, as some people expected. So our VoteCast data had the electorate around 12% under the age of 30, and more than twice that number over the age of 65. So it's still small, and because of our data also interviews registered voters who are sitting out the election, if you flip it and look at it that way, 70% of registered voters who sat out the election were under the age of 45. So that's a huge, huge portion of non-voters are young.
That's my group.
Me too.
I voted though.
But I think what was really different this time that we're still exploring in the data is how young people voted. So polling research for decades and decades has shown that young people at large tend to hold more liberal views, more likely to identify with Democrats, but young voters in election day data aren't that different than older voters oftentimes. So that sort of liberal lean really shrinks and degrades when you just look at young voters. And so in 2014, it was like on the generic House ballot, are you going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican in your House race? Young people were about plus 11 for the Democrat. This year, it was well over plus 20, almost plus 30. So what we're seeing is that young voters now are maintaining that sort of liberal lean that we see in the general population of young people at the ballot box.
Is it increasing, or is it static? Where is it exactly?
So it's definitely gone up since 2014, and it's consistent across different issue areas as well as candidate choice.
Can you pinpoint what were some of the factors, or what were some of the reason why we saw a spike between 2014 and 2018?
I mean, I don't know that we can say that there's one reason for it, but we certainly saw in this polling relationship we had with MTV, we started those surveys back in March.
Okay.
And I mean, young people were just really pessimistic about the system. I mean, like 2/3 of them, you know, saying that they had, you know, zero expectation that the system was going to get better. You know, 7 in 10 saying that politics is basically just dysfunctional in this country at this point. Very few people, only I think 17% of young folks think that the polarization has any chance of getting better in the next 5 years. So people went into this election really concerned about the overall system, and they were revved up about the midterms. You know, they thought that 2/3 of people were saying that they have, their generation has the ability to affect change. 2/3 of them thought that the midterms were actually consequential and could make a difference in the country, which has not always been true historically. But they also weren't necessarily prepared for the election, and we saw fewer than a quarter of young people felt like they had enough information to be able to adjudicate between candidates, and only about 1/3 of them were telling us that they were certain to vote, which, you know, on a survey, certainty to vote tends to be pretty high. So it wasn't an overwhelming number headed into the election over the summertime, at least.
Considering that you're only young once, what's the trajectory in terms of when we eventually get to where we see a large enough, or we've reached that zenith of young people actually voting, or do we ever get there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you see, I mean, cohorts over time tend to vote more as they age. I mean, it's not just these particular generations that we're facing right now.
Because it seems so much of our discussion, so much of our policy initiatives, or so much of the resources that are expended are focused on this group of millennials. But when is there a point where we actually see a return on investment, given all of the resources, effort, and energy being put into this group? Because right now, based on what you're saying, it doesn't sound like we're seeing it. No offense, guys.
Right. I mean, it hasn't. So I think the census projects that it's in a year. In 2019, the size of the millennial generation is going to outpace the number of baby boomers in the country. So by sheer volume, that generation is far larger. But again, at the ballot box, there's still more than a 2-to-1 relationship between baby boomers who are voting and young people who are voting. And the generation has, you know, what on one hand are great opportunities for new voters, are also challenges in that it's the most diverse generation we've had in the country too. But the larger proportions of some subgroups in the millennial generation also historically have lower rates of voting. So it is definitely not a monolithic generation by any sense. So, I mean, over time, they will vote. You know, you even see our data didn't quite cut at the generational level. So we were looking for the midterm data, we were looking at people under 30, and then we looked at people, you know, 30 to 45. And you see, so the millennials cross that bridge, and you already see the numbers ticking up in terms of turnout in that next age group.
About 2 weeks ago, before the election, I had a reporter from thehill.com on my radio show, and we were having this conversation about the Hispanic vote, and we were calling it the X factor because we didn't know. There was a lot of discussion about if they would turn out for the 2018 elections, and if they did, what it would mean, and if they did not, what kind of impact it would have. And one of the overarching threads in that discussion was that this is not a monolithic group, and they are different. Their voting patterns are different geographically as well as demographically. You have the Cuban population in South Florida, for example. They vote in really high numbers, whereas in some other places you may not see that number. And so recognizing that the millennial group is not a monolithic group, did you, in some of your polling information, did you see data where you saw where there was maybe a spike in millennial voting patterns in one place versus another, or based on a demographic group within that that larger group of millennials?
Yeah. So I mean, they showed up a little bit more often where it counted in some of the more competitive races this year. So, you know, the national average was about 12% of the electorate under 30. It went up by a couple points in places like Texas and Nevada, some of these key races, Georgia. And in those areas, the millennial or the young people vote was even more strongly tilted toward the Democrats. So, I mean, huge Democratic vote among young people in the Texas Senate race. And also, another factor around the millennials was the how they voted is very different than older generations. So some of the new data that are just starting to come out from the registered voter lists are showing that millennials, like a twofold increase in the early vote among millennials compared to 2014 midterms, voting early. And in some states, like Texas and Nevada, it was almost a fivefold increase in the early vote. So, you know, the country's been headed that way for a long time, but some of those structural and institutional changes are also, you know, hopefully going to get more young people involved.
Well, this is good. We're having this conversation about the numbers and looking at the breakdown of the numbers of millennial votes. But now what we want to do is we want to expand this and look at some of the patterns and look at what this impact means overall for voting going forward, and also get a sense of why and how we got here. So what we want to do now is we want to expand our discussion and bring out more people, more firepower. And so we have with us William Howell. He's the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago at the Harris School. And he's an interesting professor. He was not there when I was at the Harris School. And I just learned today that he's written this really exciting book. No, come sit next
right
to
over
me.
There.
Yeah, come sit
Okay,
closer.
we're gonna get close.
Yeah, we're gonna get close.
Okay.
Yeah, he actually has this theory that we need to have more presidential powers need to be placed in the executive branch, and so this is something that we do want to tease out in this larger conversation. And so we recognize it might go a little long, so we're going to lock these doors. We're going to keep you guys in here until we really finish this conversation. And also we have with us Carrie Davis. She's with the Joyce Foundation, and she's the program director of the Democracy Program. Thanks so much, Carrie, for being with us. And finally, we have a millennial who is here also. So we wanted to be mindful of you in the audience. And so Stephen Olakara is with us, and he is the founder and president of the Millennial Action Project. Thanks, Stephen, for being here. So since this is a conversation about the millennials and the midterms, we're going to start with Stephen.
Oh, boy.
And because Stephen is a millennial, he actually cannot run for president because he's too young.
Yeah. He asked me backstage.
I did. I figured since Michelle Obama said that she's tapping Sasha to run, I said, Stephen, let's sign you up. But he said he's too young. So Stephen, we're still looking at the numbers from this election. Give us your initial thoughts, particularly on how you, listening to this conversation that we've been having, about millennials. Give us your thought on where we stand and where millennials are right now as it relates to the political landscape.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Eric, and thank you to the Harris School of Public Policy for hosting us. My good friend, Mark Farinella, is standing backstage, and I just want to thank you, Mark, for inviting me to be here, and to all of you, really appreciate you making time on this evening, cold evening, to talk about this generation. So just a piece of brief background. I run an organization called the Millennial Action Project, and it's premised on a very simple idea, which is this next generation that's coming into public office needs to do a better job than the status quo right now. And the particular piece of the problem that we're trying to tackle is the worsening gridlock and polarization. And when we were founding this organization back in 2013, we were reading the founding documents of our country, including the Federalist Papers, and one thing the founders talked about consistently was their warnings of extreme factionalism of the exact sort we're seeing today, and how that could really undermine democracy. And so the goal of our organization is to engage these young elected officials who are just getting started in public service to transcend this political divide and hopefully push us into the future on a number of different policy areas. So it's interesting now with this election, we predicted back in February that we would see the highest ever millennial turnout in a midterm, and that happened. Roughly, the age definition of millennials and the way that they study youth turnout is a little bit off, but most estimates has it somewhere around 30-ish% in terms of turnout, which would be the highest certainly for millennials and probably the highest in about 25 years in this younger age demographic. And I think what we're seeing is a response to the headlines, which we all read every day, the fact that our country is becoming very hostile to immigrants. And the Harvard Public Policy School had a poll showing that the issue of immigration and refugee-related issues was the #1 issue for millennials in this election. Now, so I think among other issues, I think gun violence was a major issue too. We've had the honor of working with the Parkland students who have organized effectively around registering young voters all across the country. It would have been so easy after that horrific incident just to be angry, and would be rightfully so angry about our gun laws. But what they said instead is we need to channel this towards registering young voters because that's the power we have to change the course of our country. So I think a number of those issues were important, but here's the underlying issue that sometimes comes up in the polling, but not quite, which is why we ended up doing our own poll this year to fully illustrate this, which is the health of our political system itself. A belief that partisanship has stalled our ability to make progress on so many different issues. And I think what we're seeing is this generation that doesn't want to get boxed into Democrat or Republican. A lot of the polling by Pew, for example, has shown that a plurality of us actually identifies as independent. We're rejecting this binary set of choices we have, but then when we go and engage in the political system, it's set up along those binary lines. And so there's a bit of a disconnect. And then you add to that the problems of gerrymandering, the money in politics, these things that erode our trust. So moving forward, I think one of the issues we'll have to address now that we came out in historic numbers, although I still think it's not high enough yet, is to enact some serious political reform that can restore trust to government. And there will be an opportunity to do that next year. And the key for all of us is to make sure that's done in a bipartisan way. So we'll see about that.
Yeah, I actually had to cover that March on Washington that took place in the wake of the Parkland shooting. And when I was walking to the march, there were like all of these people standing on these corners, and they had on these vests. These I think they were orange vests. And so I thought they were simply there directing people where to go. And I happened to just walk by a group of them, and they were actually out there registering people to vote. And I was so surprised by that. And I thought, wow, these people are actually going to take over the country.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I thought it was so amazing to see how they organized and how energized they were, and just seeing the sea of young people. And also, what was really striking about it, covering it, was the fact that the entire event was staged and organized by young people.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think anyone on the stage was probably older than 18. I mean, many people who were on that stage probably were not even able to vote. And as I was there watching it and covering it, I was thinking to myself, what kind of impact will this have on this midterm election? And so I think we got a sense of the power that young people wield, particularly when they get energized behind an issue. But also, I think one thing that we saw play out, and I really want to get your thoughts on this, Carrie, particularly as it relates to states like Georgia and Kansas. And I think this is something that could have, we could see where it turns off, I think, young people, and that's this issue or this idea of voter suppression. And you've been working on this issue of voting rights advocacy and voter rights for quite some time. And that has been such a central part of the discussion in states where I think, particularly like a state like Georgia, where we probably saw a lot of young people galvanized and energized, wanting to go to the polls, but then seeing what was taking place there. What does something like that do, not only to deter people from going to the polls, but what kind of impact will it have basically on this idea for young people who actually want to be a part of the process, when it seems like they already have a pretty dark view of the process to begin with?
Well, one of the things that's interesting that we're seeing this year is, well, there's a host of obstacles showing up in front of voters, whether it's voter ID laws, signature matches, difficulty registering, host of these challenges that are popping up. There is a strong push this year to overcome that. And we're seeing that in communities across the country. So the issue in North Dakota that so many of us read about regarding Native American voters, were having issues being able to vote because their ID didn't have a street address, it had a PO box, because many of the reservation addresses didn't actually have a street address. They unfortunately did not get any relief in the court, and instead used that frustration as a mobilizer to really drive them to work harder. And the tribal government and the voter advocacy groups rallied to help say, all right, we're gonna find an ID, we're gonna get you an ID, we wanna make sure you vote. And while we're still crunching the numbers, because we only have unofficial data at this stage, there are a lot of voters that overcame that. We saw the same issues with some of the voter suppression issues in Georgia, that there were 53,000 voter registrations that were being held for reasons that the court said no to, but really encouraging voters not to let them dissuade them and to show up. And while we don't even have full numbers in Georgia yet, part of the reason for that is because we had this huge surge of turnout. People were mobilized, they were upset, they used this to motivate them to get out and vote. And we're seeing that in Florida, in Georgia, and a whole bunch of states that there's still obstacles. So we can't ignore that fact. There are real obstacles that we need to solve, but it's not stopping voters. If anything, it's energizing them, saying, you're not taking this right to vote away from me.
Professor Howell, I just learned about this idea that you have today, and which is and so yes, it's like Christmas for me, and I'm so fascinated by it. But I want to get your thoughts in terms of when we look at young people and the rate that they're coming out to vote. Speak about what you think it means for our institutions. If we're looking at this idea of voting rights, and if that's a concern now, but yet we're seeing young people being galvanized, what role do these variables play as it relates to our institutions?
Let me offer a couple of comments. They'll be somewhat disjointed, but the first thing to say is that this is a period of heightened polarization. We know that. We're at historic highs in terms of polarization. It's also a time when the majority party has razor-thin margins. So we've seen much of the post-war period was a period of consistent Democratic majorities in Congress for decades at a stretch. And we're now in this period where we're jumping back and forth. repeatedly across elections in terms of who has the majority, which compounds the problem of gridlock. This cuts in two ways. One, it says we can go back and forth, which means that any constituency that's underrepresented in voting, like people who are young, who then get mobilized, can have a meaningful impact. This is not unique to people who are young, but the young folks are historically underrepresented in our elections, and so they stand to have a big impact on the one hand. On the other hand, you were suggesting earlier, well, if we can come together in a kind of truly bipartisan way, I don't see that happening, right? And these issues about voter suppression are highly polarized. I mean, and infused with partisan concerns. So on the other side, it's not about voter suppression, it's about the integrity of our elections. And there are partisan reasons for that, right? It's that on the one hand, the demographics of this country don't play well for the Republican Party. And the people who are at the margin, people who are black and brown, people who are young, disproportionately heir to the Democratic Party. And so if you're on the Republican side, you have all kinds of incentives to care a lot about the integrity of elections and keep the franchise as small as possible. And it's not an accident, I'll go out and say, that in those domains where the fewest number of people are voting, both in terms of population and in terms of turnout, you see Republicans doing better. And so these partisan concerns are going to continue to infuse our politics, and it's going to make things very difficult to actually get something done. So it's a big deal that the Democrats got a hold of a majority of the House. I, for one, am not hopeful that that's going to translate into meaningful cooperative change over the next 2 years. And I can't believe we've been talking about politics for this long and nobody said Donald Trump. Right? We haven't said, right? This is a big part of what's driving, right? I think actually a lot of the dynamic that we're seeing as well.
I'm going to say this, this is just the picture that's being painted. I'm seeing millennials as snowflakes, but I think there's more there. So Jennifer, talk to us about the numbers, because it seems like there are so many impediments that could keep young people away from the polls. They may be bothered by the fact that they think politicians aren't speaking for them or speaking to them. This issue of voter suppression, if it's a thing, they may see that as something that's keeping them from the polls. And so in your polling data, is there information that speaks to or that addresses how, in fact, young people actually see the process? And that do they see themselves as being part of the change, or do they see themselves as pulling away from the system?
I think the data are showing that they are very much dissatisfied with the system, but we haven't seen much to say that they feel removed from the system. It seems they are, for all intents and purposes, willing to play in the system. So we see that they very much believe in their own generation too, which I think is a difference, at least anecdotally, from my Gen X generation. And they really do believe that they have the power to change. We've asked them if they think folks from their own generation would make better leaders than the people sitting in Washington now, and they overwhelmingly say that they would. And I think that we know from our own lives, we know from the political science literature that anxiety and anger are strong motivators. And they are anxious and they are angry about what's happening in Washington right now. They are really upset with the status quo in terms of who they see as having influence in politics these days, and they very much don't think that their own generation has enough of it. So I think that there are factors in play that suggest that they're willing to work within the system we have, even though, exactly correct that they don't identify with one party or the other nearly as much as prior generations, but they're still willing to work within the system, and the indicators show that they are starting to get there and they're enthusiastic about doing it.
Yeah, and Steve, that's what you're doing. I mean, you're working with members of Congress, you're working with legislators. So you're actually part of, I mean, you're an institutionalist. You're part of the system. You're trying to actually make it better, and you're trying to take people like this in the audience, and you're trying to bring them into the process. Is that something, I mean, obviously you think it can work. What's your time frame that you see this? I mean, will I be middle-aged? Will you all be middle-aged before you get there?
Well, first of all, I like to think of ourselves as insurrectionists within institutionalism. And what that means is when we're on the inside of these legislative institutions, we're often rejecting the way things have always been done. And that's why coming into early next year around the new speaker election, and when they set the new rules for the House of Representatives, there is going to be a major battle fought by our members. We have a congressional caucus, the first ever of millennials in Congress, called the Future Caucus. And those millennials are going to be battling up against their leadership, in many cases in their own party, to say that we need to change the way that business is done. And traditionally, those issues have been seen as very wonky and boring, but we're trying to bring a lot of awareness to it. I mean, it's things like, how do chairmen of committees get selected? Right now, it's based on how much money do you raise and how much do you toe the party line. And then our group is saying, no, that's not how we're playing this game here. Actually, some of our members don't raise any money for their party's committee. They rather are proposing right now that each committee's leadership should be decided by that committee's membership. And so therefore you have to do, I mean, it's just like how many students do we have here? Raise your hand if you're a student. And keep your hand raised if you are involved in a student organization. So in your student, you're like, I don't know if in your student organizations, you elect your president, your vice president, your executive board based on who has earned their path to leadership, who's done the best job, who's earned the trust and credibility amongst that organization. Well, I think that's how it should work in Congress as well. So there's so many of these different rules changes. We're actually also proposing term limits, because one thing we've noticed with this younger generation coming in that's interesting is we don't see elected office really as a career that we do for 40 years. We see it more as a gig. We're going to come in, go make an impact maybe over the course of 3 or 4 terms, and then go and do something else. Because that's actually what the founders originally envisioned, is a citizen legislature. You go in and make the laws, and then you leave as a private citizen to live under those laws. So that's the tension that I'm talking about. I've always been a believer in strong political institutions as a means of reconciling and representing the diversity of our country. And that's really why the idea that our founders had was truly revolutionary, is we can resolve our differences through the legislative process instead of through violence. That's a pretty great idea, I think. But what we need to do is reinvent those institutions for the 21st century, and that's what our members are on the cutting edge of doing.
Sure. When we talk about young people, we tend to look at young people as change agents. And so that's what we're seeing. And a part of that change, at least that we saw this year was billed as the Year of the Woman, much like what we saw back in, I believe it was 1994, could have been 92. Where you saw a wave of women running for office and succeeding. And so that's what we're seeing. That's what we've seen so far this year, a record number of women winning not only a national office, but also at the state level as well. And so, Carrie, I want to get your thoughts on this. When we see a record number of women engaging in the process, combined also with young people and also being part of that group of young people that are making this change. What does that say that now we're seeing this explosion of women, of young women, actually deciding now that they want to be part of this process?
That's very true. This year we've had this huge surge in young voters and women and young people being elected to office. For the first time, we will have 100 women in the U.S. House. That hasn't happened. That's exciting. Go team. And we saw this in a lot of ways. It started with the Women's March in early 2017 after the current president took office. And organizations that train women candidates like She Should Run had they had people beating down their doors. They kept having to find bigger and bigger venues and adding more and more training events because they were just deluged with women who wanted to run for office, who wanted to be candidates at every level of government, not just Congress, state offices, local offices. We've had this huge surge. And it's also the candidates are more diverse. And that's been just fascinating across the board to look at who has won elections. We are going to have 2 Muslim members of Congress. That's new. We have a Pakistani American member of Congress. We have a openly bisexual senator. I mean, the diversity that we have with the folks who are elected this year is absolutely fascinating. And there are a bunch of different factors. We're all studying this and nerding out and trying to figure out, it's like, all right, what's the secret sauce that made it happen this year? And we were talking backstage a little bit about that, really trying to dig in and figure that out. And some of the early research, and this was something that we did with PRI, Public Religion Research Institute, and worked with them on a series of polling relating to democracy issues. And especially digging in deep on civic engagement and what's really compelling people to get active. And one of the most fascinating things that we found had to do with encouragement. When somebody is encouraged to be highly civically active, and that would include voting, but other forms of civic activism as well, volunteering in your community, participating in marches and rallies, contacting elected officials, big picture civic engagement. Individuals were 2 to 3 times more likely to be highly engaged if somebody in their life had asked them to. A parent, a sibling, a teacher, a celebrity, 2 to 3 times as high, regardless of who it was. Because we often wondered, all right, we have these celebrities doing big pushes, we have schools doing big pushes, what's working? The answer is yes, all of them. And there was this really dramatic push this year, and we're all digging into to see if it worked. So some of the early anecdotal data, and we're trying to put actual numbers on it right now, where the March for Our Lives organization, the Parkland students and their peers, had their series, their tour around the country to urge people to vote. They flipped races in those same locations. And we've got the anecdotal data. We're waiting on the hard election results, but it's matching up. Tennessee races should not have been competitive, but Taylor Swift said, hey, get out there and register and vote, and Tennessee became competitive. So this is what we're looking at, is this role of encouragement, whether it's from a celebrity, a teacher, a family member, any form of encouragement has this 2 to 3 times return on people being highly engaged. And I think that's one of the things that's unique this cycle. In the last 2 years, we've had marches, we've had rallies, we've had lots of targeted efforts to get people engaged, and it worked. So how do we keep that going?
Professor, we've seen, this was a record election. A lot of people showed up. And in many places, it looked like the system couldn't handle all the people who came out. What does that say for our institutions? Address that for us, but then also, what does it mean for our institutions when you have so many change agents? Steve, would you call it insurrection?
Yeah, we're insurrectionists. Within the institution.
Insurrectionist institution. What does it mean when you have all of that? What kind of weight does that put on our institutions?
It puts a lot on. So here's a sobering thought. When it's easy when you take one group, at a particular group that you like, at a time, and you say, where are the opportunities to affect change? And it turns out there are lots of opportunities in our system of government because policy is made at all levels of government. It's made in the courts, it's made in state legislatures, it's made all over the place. Okay, so there are lots of points of entry. And And then when you are trying to affect change, that's a reason for hope. The thing is, there are a lot of young people who have a particular agenda. There are a whole lot of other groups with all kinds of other agendas. And they all have points of entry. So think about education policy for a minute. And think about, like, what does a good school look like? Well, one thing a good school looks like is, you might say, is a professionalized environment in which teachers are given the space that they need in order to run classrooms in ways that are to the good. Yeah? Okay, we want to create an environment where teachers are supported and given discretion. But if you look at education policy, it's anything but that, right? You've got mandates being handed down from every which way, expectations, requirements, all kinds of forms that need to be kept track of, funding that comes from 17 different directions. Why is that? That's because you have the courts involved, and school boards involved, and state legislatures involved, and the president involved, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The thing that then becomes sobering, right, is that then the very thing that gets you excited, that says there are lots of points of entry, I can make a difference, also allows everybody else to make a difference as well, which collectively can create pathologies, which make things worse off for everybody. Now, I don't want to push this too hard. I'm not saying this is a general thesis. It's more sort of word of caution, that the very things that are opportunities are not just opportunities for one group, they're opportunities for lots of groups. That's the system our founders created, and there's lots of good that comes of that. It's the reason why we don't have as much violence, I think, through our politics. But it also can create, well, you called it weight, right? Which I think is right, or policy complexity, or a hyper-regulated environment, or rigidity, and it's sometimes gridlock, which is troubling.
But that's why we're here. That's why we study this, right? Because everyone's trying to get their piece.
Yes.
And so that's what everyone is doing, right? Everyone is fighting
that's
for
right.
a peace. The insurrectionists are fighting for their peace.
But that's why
the women, they want their peace.
This is where I say education policy is a helpful place to look. There are a million causes associated with education, right? There's the real estate folk. There's the textbook folk. There's the moral majority folk, right? They're the young people. They're the students themselves, the parents. They're all looking to get their piece. And what that creates is an environment that is unbelievably thick. And it's sort of saturated with opinion and claims made upon, in this instance, teachers who have a really hard time than actually doing the job of teaching. Again, this is all by way of word of caution. I don't want to push this too hard, but I think I've just noticed that on each of the things that we've been talking about, there are other groups that appropriate these claims and push them in very different directions, right? And they too are looking for their piece as well. And what we have is a system of politics that accommodates them all in some ways.
And I guess we're going to probably say, we were talking about this backstage, about who's running in 2020. And so we were saying, oh, you should run, or these people are going to run. And I think that's what we're seeing, because everyone thinks not only can they or should they be engaged, but everyone thinks that they should have their piece. And so with the little bit of time that we have left, what I want to do is look at where do we go from here? What's next? And so Jennifer, I want you to start this piece off for us in terms of looking at the numbers. What do the numbers say, not just for where we may go in 2020, but what do they say about millennials and where our system stands right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, what the data showed on this round is that young people came out with a liberal policy and candidate choice point of view. And whether you're looking at candidates or issue positions, or we asked about several ballot issues, things like giving convicted felons the franchise back in Florida, or marijuana legalization in Michigan and North Dakota, young people just overwhelmingly voted this time in a liberal direction. And oftentimes completely flipped for those older Americans, but they're still getting outpaced in terms of their numbers at the ballot box. Older people are still showing up more. There's more of them showing up. And so their issue positions the effect of them are getting dampened. So as the generation moves forward and more of them continue to be engaged and more of them continue to vote, I think that's where you'll see, across all these different entry points in the system, these positions will start to take hold in different ways, whether it's the candidates that we're electing, what's showing up on the ballot to vote for, or the ways in which business is getting done in Washington. So they have strong positions, and it's just a matter of the numbers catching up with that.
Steve, what she's saying is you guys got a lot of work to do.
We sure do.
Yeah. How do you change that? What's your agenda? What's the agenda? I mean, recognizing that the millennials, much like every other group, is not a monolithic group, but unfortunately, there's still some lagging in terms of catch up. And so, where are some of the pressure points where you can apply some of that to actually see growth? Right. In 2020 and beyond?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think one of the challenges we often face with millennial and youth engagement is translating the energy into action and into real governance. And I came, when I was the same age as a lot of the students here, I was involved in a lot of campus organizing. And one thing I noticed about a lot of those efforts is if you can't actually move a legislator towards the issue that you're working on, then your effect is going to be very limited. And I also saw a lot of major voter registration efforts, which are very effective. But again, if you're not creating political power with the legislators, there was always that disconnect. And so what I have been focused on really over the last 5 years is trying to figure out, how do you translate all of that great voting energy into a real agenda, as you're mentioning, and real legislative action. And I think the key here, as we look out over the next 5 to 10 years, as not only more millennials, as we've been predicting on this panel, will vote in higher and higher numbers, but also more candidates will be running and getting elected to office. By the way, as a quick side note there, highest number of millennials will be serving in this next Congress, 30. Almost evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, and it really spans the whole political spectrum too, from very liberal to very conservative. So it's an interesting group, and we're going to be doing our best to kind of unite their political power. But the key is going to be, can we get a few big wins, and then can we get that message out to people so millennials have that reinforcement? One of the concerns I have is that we have this big voter turnout this year, and then we don't feel like there's any follow-up to it. And I think we saw that dynamic a bit in 2008, when a lot of folks kind of more in my age range voted for the first time and there was no follow-up. But what we need to do is make sure that a lot of the issues that we care about, whether it's guns or climate change or immigration, we can get some wins. And here's the importance of really getting the message out. This past year, we've been talking about the Parkland students. We had the honor of working with them around the big march in Washington, and we were trying to figure out what's one bipartisan thing that we could do. And we found that there had been a 2 decades-long ban on the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, from studying gun violence as a public health issue. And I'm really proud to say that our Congressional Future Caucus, which is this group of millennials, decided to propose lifting that ban. And it only got traction because we had Republicans signed on to it. It became a bipartisan bill. After we had those Republicans sign on, it actually passed it passed Congress, and it got signed into law on the eve of March for Our Lives. And now today, the CDC is authorized and is getting funded to study gun violence as a public health issue. That's a really big deal. And so what we need to do now is tell some of these success stories so young people know that their vote and their energy and their engagement is leading to real results. The thing I'm worried about, though, is there are folks, even in the gun violence space who had no idea that this bill ever got passed. So we got to get the message out there. And then the other big one that we have to work on over the next few years here are some of these long-term challenges like climate change and like the debt that all of us are going to be inheriting in the future, and trying to transcend some of the old divisions on those issues. The good news is that we are actually seeing some pretty significant progress there that, again, most folks don't know. But since we're the insurrectionists on the inside of the institution, we get to see some of these things up close.
We do want to get to some questions, but Carrie, I want to make sure I get any last thoughts or comments from you before we take questions from the audience.
Two really quick things, thank you. The first is the other avenue to make change. Speaking of insurrectionists, we've seen a huge surge in what we call direct democracy, where people organize to put issues on the ballot because the people who are elected are ignoring them. And that happened a lot this cycle. We had a lot of ballot issues, including an insurrectionist millennial in Michigan named Katie Fahey, who organized right after the 2016 election, said, hey guys, this gerrymandering thing is really broken. Who's with me? Let's fix it. They set records for the number of volunteer signatures collected to put that on the ballot. They raised the money to fight in their state Supreme Court to keep it on the ballot. And it passed by a 2-to-1 margin last week. That was huge. And we had voting rights and the restoration of the felon right to vote in Florida. And I mean, just an amazing wealth of issues that passed across the country because of these insurrectionist organizers. And my last thing, and I have to nerd out on the numbers, but you might appreciate this one. Here in Chicago, and these are the numbers from the Chicago Board of Elections, the highest voter turnout was in the age group of 25 to 34. The second highest was 35 to 44. So voters under 35 and voters under 45 outvoted boomers in Chicago. They came in third.
Congrats to you guys.
Yeah. So cheers, Chicago, we beat the trend. We're doing something here that works.
Yes, you are.
And can I just mention, because you mentioned the Michigan gerrymandering reform, there are 6 or 7 states now, including Colorado and Ohio and other states, because of referendums primarily, but also some bipartisan legislative action that has put an end to partisan gerrymandering. So I just think it's important for people to believe that politics is about the art of the possible, and when you engage, a lot of good things happen.
Let's take some questions from you guys. We want to hear what you have to say. Are there any? We got some mics right here on either side. So just raise your hand. There's one right there in the back. Let's take her.
I was just wondering if any of you had explored data on the effect of the digital lives that this group of people, which I hesitate to call millennials because I don't even know what that means anymore, but the one characteristics that young people have now that they don't share with their predecessors is that they've grown up with a digital life. And so one thing that I've thought about is that, you know, in the digital world, there is no political infrastructure. You can do whatever the hell you want, you know, and government doesn't really exist in a very obvious way. So I just wondered if that was part of the research that any of you had done.
Jennifer, did you see anything in terms of that being an influence or impact?
I mean, we definitely saw with our MTV partnership that young people were doing a ton of engagement digitally and sharing of information. We asked a little bit about encouraging other people to go out and vote, and it was, you know, a little lower levels, but still higher than you might expect. And we've also done a lot of work with some partners at the American Press Institute looking at how millennials get news, and trying to, the data are showing that sort of busting this myth that they're a newsless generation, which was how the media was thinking about them for a long time. And so there's now, with our work, a lot of data showing that they get a lot of news. They get sometimes more news than other generations, but they just engage with it in a very, very different way than older generations did. So yeah, I mean, I think the numbers are there to support that they're engaging digitally, and that they're using that specifically in the political arena.
Steve, how are you guys using all of these digital platforms to reach out and shape and educate young people?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely important for the obvious reason that most young people are living online. And there are a couple important things to keep in mind with this. One is we need to expand this movement for online voter registration, and we're able to get that done in Ohio. And I think the fact of having it online makes a huge impact for young people, and you could potentially even go a step further and just make it automatic voter registration, although there are some kind of pros and cons associated with that. But I think just being able to get more of the democratic process online is hugely important. The second dimension that's interesting is the engagement with elected officials. And this actually isn't just among young electeds. It also is Gen Xers and even some boomers who spend, honestly, I would say for the baby boomers, sometimes spend way too much time following their Twitter account. And the crazy thing is, if you want to get an issue on the radar of an elected official, it used to be that you had to organize, maybe tens of thousands of letters to their offices, and you organize these huge campaigns, and that's still, extremely important, not to discount that. But now just the barrier is so much lower for engaging with electeds directly on Facebook and Twitter, because I've been in the room with some of them as they're checking their Facebook and Twitter accounts, and trust me, if you're saying some bad things about them on Facebook, they're going to take notice real fast. Mm-hmm. They care about their reputations online. So even, I'm talking not huge numbers, like, even for a member of Congress, if they start to get 20, 30, 40, 50, negative comments or just concerned comments on their Facebook wall, I guarantee you at least a staffer is going to follow up on that or somehow address it, but probably sometimes, and this is not always the right decision, but the members will reply directly and engage with their constituents. But in a more constructive sense, though, there are a lot of cool and innovative digital platforms emerging that seek to really compile public input for elected officials. One of my favorites is called PopVox. You can check them out, popvox.com, popvox.com. And what they do is they verify that you're an actual constituent, and they will deliver your input directly to those offices. And you can actually see in real time how your other fellow constituents are responding to issues. So I think the whole digital space can be potentially a net positive, but we have to also deal with the increasing tribal instincts that we often find online as well. So we have to deal with that.
Professor, overall, when we look at this whole digital space, is it a net positive or net negative in terms of institutions?
Well, isn't the answer that the most striking feature is not the mean, but the variance? Right? That is, it's not how it all adds up to in the main, but you have radically different poles that in some domains it's truly awful, and in other ways it can be really empowering. I think that's what I would suggest. I think there are ways in which it's being deployed and having a big effect. There was a recent study done where they at Facebook, people who posted, you could have a badge that would show that you were in fact a constituent. And they were interested whether or not that would elicit more responses from your elected officials when you could demonstrate that you were his or her constituent. It turns out it had a tiny, tiny effect. I mean, you would get the responses when they happened were a couple of words longer. So that's not a revolutionary thing, probably, that particular innovation. But I think there are innovations being tried all over the place, and sure, some will take, and many won't.
Yeah. More questions? Oh, more hands. Lots of hands. Let's take this guy. Let's take this guy right here. And did I see a hand over here? Okay, and we'll come to you next. Okay, and then we'll get you right here.
So, less based on the millennial discussion that obviously we're having here, but at the very beginning, specifically Jennifer, when you came out, there was talk about what the media missed in 2016, and Fox and the AP changing the way that they view exit polls or not even using them at all. And so with this election cycle, and with all these different avenues for people to participate, whether it's absentee voting, early voting, mail-in ballots, we see an election night where the narrative coming out is Democrats win 25 seats, whereas it looks like over the past week, it turns out Democrats have won about 40 right? So as we have these, as the media reflects on the narrative that it creates the night of election, where, we turn on CNN and it shows that there's 100% of votes reporting, right? Or 100% precincts reporting, but there's still counts in California. How do you think that, what do you think the media will learn after these midterms, after we see the narrative kind of change a week later? And also, how do these different avenues for participation impact our voters' abilities to understand how our systems of voting actually work? Because we have people who are confused, like, oh, well, I thought all the ballots were counted. How come a Democrat in Arizona is still getting more ballots, right?
Can I throw something out along these lines, which we haven't said, just to add to the mix? It seems to me the biggest force that we're up against, if you're interested in a healthy democracy, is populism and the rise of populism domestically, and the efforts to undermine a sense of the legitimacy of our political institutions and our electoral process. And I think I hear all of three of you sort of wanting to push back against that in different ways, and so there is possibility here, just as there are, I think there are big forces that are at play that are trying to suggest that it's all rigged, it's all broken through and through, which creates disaffection and creates another kind of anger, which is deeply corrosive. And so when we want to think about what does progress look like, seems to me a big part of it is the fight against populism.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think what this election and the last election, the election before that, reveal is that our voting systems are horribly outdated and they need to be modernized. And part of the reason why we keep going through this cycle over and over again is there's a lot of hoopla just after election time about how broken our voting systems are. Not broken, to your point, I shouldn't go that far, but not efficient enough. Is after the election, there might be some kind of commission, but ultimately the momentum really fades away. And I think, again, it really falls on our generation to really add some fire to this issue and really call for, when the democracy reform legislation is proposed next year, that we make the modernization of our voting systems part of that. The reason it's complicated is because we don't have one uniform, federal set of requirements necessarily for how these voting systems are set up, which is why the ballots look tremendously different. Some are more electronic, some are just totally, in the 19th century, style ballots. And we need to do something where, in the 1960s, we had the Voting Rights Act, and I think we need some form of a Voting Rights Act for our generation that makes sure that our votes are counted in a timely fashion. I mean, there's just no excuse for that today.
Yeah, and I can say, as someone just who had to cover this live on air, it's a real pain in the ass when you've got like 3 or 4 different entities giving you 3 or 4 different outcomes, and you're on the air, and then you've got your producer in your ear saying, okay, these are the numbers. Oh no, scratch that. This is what we got. Okay, say this. Oh no, sorry, we just got this in. And it just makes you really clamor for, there's got to be a better, more uniform way of doing this. So because our job is to actually simply just report what's happening. And it's so difficult to do that, yeah.
Could I add 2 thoughts on that? One, just directly to your question about the reporting of results. We didn't used to, as a country, demand to know all the election results election night.
Right. This is true.
Thank you.
That is a cultural change, that we want to know instantaneously who's won and who's not, and somebody must have done something wrong if we don't have that answer. First, I just want to call into question that initial premise. Let's get it right. Getting it right is more important than getting it fast. The second thing is, we've had this happen before. This is not new in this country for there to be a problem getting election results quickly. It has happened. It happened in 2000 in Florida with Bush v. Gore, and the knee-jerk response then was to pass the Help America Vote Act, which appropriated a whole bunch of federal dollars that went out to states saying, we can't have punch cards ballots anymore. We need to switch everybody over to these electronic touchscreens or to some other kind of electronic system. Well, guess what? Those systems are now old. How many of you are using a computer that was bought in 2003? No. but there wasn't any more money to replace them. So all the election officials are trying to scrounge by, and this is whether it's voting machines, tabulating equipment, the server they use to compile all the results. There are lots of pieces of technology that need to be up to date. One of the counties that was having problems getting their counts in Florida, it's because they had a really old piece of equipment that crashed in the middle of the count because it wasn't built to be running 24/7. It was supposed to be used for intermittent use. We don't fund election administration and infrastructure. It's not a sexy topic. There are no ribbon cutting ceremonies for it. So when we have these moments where there's this scrutiny of the results, that's when we see the change. So after 2000 in Florida, there was the Help America Vote Act money to replace machines. In 2004 in Ohio, people were in line voting until 1 a.m., even though polls closed at 7:30. Because there were huge lines, there were machine failures, there were counties that weren't able to get their counts together because things were falling apart. And in the immediate aftermath, the following year, guess what? The legislature did something to fix some of those problems. It's when we have these moments of intense scrutiny that really precipitates these changes. And I think we're on the brink of another one of them now. But I think it's important to note that this is not new.
Yeah, I agree. Just two more quick points. The one downside of a more efficient and effective voting system, if we don't get to have Wolf Blitzer, get to present these key race alerts. I just love watching him do those key race alerts. But then the second thing that I think is very positive in terms of voting reforms this year was in the state of Maine. You all need to look this up because it was so interesting. If you haven't heard about ranked choice voting, they implemented this system in Maine to make sure that a majority of the voters get to elect their representatives, not just a plurality. And we had this situation with the congressional race where we had two candidates that were under 50%. For the first time ever, they were able to reallocate the second choice of those candidates that didn't meet the threshold. And those second choices were reallocated to the top two people. And then, interestingly, the Democrat ended up winning that race and was, I think, a major success for ranked choice voting. And we're trying, we're supporters of that movement and trying to implement that in other states. And also for a lot of the millennials who want to vote for an independent but then are scared about the spoiler effect, like, I'm going to vote for an independent, but then maybe I'm taking away from my second choice. With ranked choice voting, you get rid of that completely. You can vote who you really, really care about, even if they don't have a shot at winning, and then your second choice can be a more realistic option, and you don't end up spoiling the race. So I think that what just happened in Maine is very positive.
There's a lawsuit challenging it, so we'll find out.
Yeah, no, we will find out. I don't think the lawsuit will win. But.
We have to leave it there, unfortunately. I am so sorry, guys. I did want to hear from all of you on your questions, but I want to thank all of you for coming out. And let me also just say, particularly to our prospective students out there, these are just a few of the issues that the Harris School is actually tackling. And these are some of the issues that we're going to continue to tackle. And we need and we want people like you to be a part of this, to be part of the solution to these complex issues, these complex problems that we're facing today. So on behalf of all of us, we certainly want to thank you for braving the cold, braving the snow, and coming out here. And also feel free to tackle these guys up here if we didn't get a chance to get to your questions. Thank you so much for coming out.